Hi everyone, Rani from IKN. So I want to talk to you today about this idea of forced deceleration preceding forced production and why it's important to consider this, especially within the context of rehabilitation and also within the context of real-world movement as well. How we actually prepare the client for real-world movements in the presence of lots of unpredictable stressors and forces acting on our body. Now, when it comes to forced production, this is typically what we learn about when we're going through school, especially if you're a physical therapist or a movement therapist. You learn an awful lot about how we produce force, how we overcome forces. And so if we were to look at it in the context of, let's say, upper limb movement, when I'm reaching for a particular target or when I'm reaching to pick up some kind of object, I have to have some kind of intention that actually gives me the ability to organize that movement strategy around. So if I don't have any kind of intention, there's no goal, there's no target. And so all the other levels beneath the level of your intention have nothing to self-organize towards. And so let's describe this within the context of, let's say, upper limb movement. Left upper limb movement is if I'm reaching to pick up a marker or a cup of coffee or something. So let's say it moves from point A to point B. So we have point A here in the nervous system where the actual intention or the target is created, right? And that kickstarts this sequence of force production, and that kickstarts the ability for everything to self-organize towards that object. So if I have point A here and point B here at the hand, this is important to understand as well, because when I'm organizing a movement from a force production standpoint, I have to be very strategic with where I actually organize that movement around. And this is important from a movement efficiency standpoint. So if I'm reaching to pick up something, let's say I'm reaching to pick up this marker from the shelf there, my nervous system isn't necessarily going to organize that movement around what my shoulder is doing or around what my elbow is doing, because that's not going to be very efficient from an energy standpoint, because that's a lot of resources to try and control the infinite possibilities of movement at the shoulder, at the elbow, and at the hand. So what it will typically do is we'll typically organize movement around the distal endpoint, the end effector, which is the hand in this case. And that's strategic, because the hand is going to ultimately be the body segment that reaches and picks up the target of interest. So within that point A to point B, from a force production standpoint, there's many other local interactions that take place there. So if we were to simplify this and just look at it from a standpoint of a muscular layer, a neural layer, and a kinematic layer. So essentially the muscles, nerves and joints in between point A and point B have to interact with each other to allow you to reach your target, to reach your goal, okay? Because there's lots of things that can happen throughout that trajectory of movement. And this is again describing things from a force production standpoint. And when you're describing things from a force production standpoint, it's easy to do that as long as you respect that you're not considering that there is always constant stress acting in your body at all times. Like for me to stand up right now, there's constantly stress acting on my body. Gravity is constantly trying to pull me down to the floor. Now, I'm not consciously thinking about fighting gravity because I have lots of local interactions between the muscular layer, the neural layer, and the kinematic layer that are operating beneath my conscious awareness to maintain the ability to maintain an upright position against gravity. Now, if I had to think about everything that was going on in my body, that would be a very energy efficient strategy to use. But elements of that we see in clients expressing pain or expressing poor movement capacity. Now, here's the important part from a forced deceleration standpoint, is if we only describe movement of the upper limb, for example, from a force production standpoint, yes, it's easy, but that's not what happens within the real world environment. Because within the real world environment, like I just said, we have to understand that there's always stress acting on your body at any given time. And so that's going to change everything. That's going to make this very uncertain. And it's not going to be as easy as this step to the next step to the next step to the next step. It's a non-linear process. So let's keep it simple to understand that at the end effector, gravity is going to be acting on that end effector, which is your hand in this case. And we're just using gravity as this element of stress. So when I reach to pick up a target of interest, I have to understand that there's stress acting on that limb as I do that, okay? Now, if we describe it this way, we understand that because gravity is constantly acting on my system, and again, we're looking at this within the context of the upper limb only, I understand that there's lots of things happening throughout the body at the same time, but to keep it simple, we have to look at it from a body region standpoint. Gravity is always acting on our body. So before we actually move from point A to point B, my nervous system needs to recognize or needs to make the estimation that my system can handle the stress acting on my system before I actually produce movement. And if my nervous system determines that the structures and systems, the local interactions throughout the upper limb can't handle gravity or can't decelerate gravity, then do you think that the force production from point A to point B is going to be very efficient? Perhaps not. And understanding this constant delivery of stress to the system through gravity allows us to recognize that force deceleration, the importance of looking at how everything interacts to decelerate forces and decelerate stressors acting in your body is very, very important to understand before we produce force. So force deceleration will always precede force production. Now, it makes it a little bit more difficult to navigate that complexity, but that's why having a framework in place is extremely important to you, especially if you have a client. Let's say, for example, let's look at this within the context of some kind of musculoskeletal pain. Let's say we have a client that comes to see us with shoulder pain, and they have pain reaching their arm above their head, for example. If we were to use this kind of rough division between force production and force deceleration, as a therapist, if we're working with someone with shoulder pain and we're only thinking of the shoulder, we're narrowing our focus on the shoulder far too much, we might not get to the point where we need to get to allow them to restore not only pain-free function, but also movement of the shoulder that can handle stress. That's very robust. That's what we mean when we talk about movement robustness. That it's not just well able to be expressed in a clinic environment, in a more of a controlled environment, but can it maintain that functionality in an uncertain environment, in an unpredictable environment. So if we're looking at shoulder pain, we have to understand the shoulder within the context of the entire upper limb, but also within the context of constant stress acting on the limb. So if I have somebody with a lot of tension around the shoulder, a lot of pain around the shoulder, I need to understand, does the nervous system actually feel comfortable distributing load and stress from distal to proximal, from the hand up through the shoulder and even into the neck? So if my nervous system makes the determination that it doesn't trust the capacity of the upper limb to tolerate these stresses, to decelerate these stresses, then what do you think it might do? It might increase its level of protection. And how does the nervous system protect us? It expresses pain, it expresses increased tension. And in the context of the shoulder, very, very often what we see clinically is that there tends to be an awful lot of anticipatory tension, feed-forward tension, premature anticipatory tone when we're reaching with the upper limb, because the nervous system doesn't feel comfortable with you reaching, and so it increases the tone in an anticipatory fashion before you reach, and so we end up with perhaps an awful lot of tone around the upper trap, around the rotator cuff, around the shoulder itself, that doesn't allow our upper limb to move with efficiency. But the way we actually go about that clinically from a rehabilitation standpoint is looking at the shoulder within the context of the entire upper limb, looking at the ability of the end effector, the hand, to distribute load well from distal to proximal. And there's many other features of the upper limb that we want to look at as well, but we're looking at it in terms of capacities. Does the upper limb express the capacity to handle stress so we can ultimately produce force in a much more efficient manner? And this requires us to like you've heard here, is look at the biomechanics of the upper limb in a simplistic fashion, but also recognize how the nervous system organizes the movement of the upper limb. And if we can do this, and if we can model our assessments and rehabilitation using this lens, it actually becomes very, very easy to guide a specific rehab plan to restore that movement robustness of the shoulder within the context of the entire upper limb. So key points here is understanding that force deceleration will precede force production. We have to look at the individual components within the context of the bigger body region. So with the shoulder here, for example, we need to look at it within the context of the entire upper limb. We need to understand that, again, gravity is going to be, or stress is going to act more so on the end effector, because that's the thing that my nervous system is organizing movement around. My nervous system isn't necessarily organizing that movement of picking up a marker with my elbow or with my shoulder. The stereotypical behavior of force production is organized around the end effector, the distal endpoint. So we need to understand pain and limitations in movement of a specific body part within the context of a bigger body region. And looking at this idea, this division between force deceleration and force production. And there's many other features that need to be respected here as well, especially with the local interactions between the muscle, the nerves, and the joints. But like I said, if we can have a model, if we can have a particular framework that allows us to navigate the complexity of this within a clinical setting, then we can have a much clearer process of how we assess things and how we rehabilitate or treat things, and ultimately allow the client to restore that movement in a pain-free fashion. Because very often we find that if we have somebody with, if we're teaching some physical therapists or other movement practitioners, it's all about, okay, what's weak? How can we strengthen these muscles that need to get the shoulder moving in that direction? But we don't recognize that there's already stress acting on the system. So if we improve the force deceleration capacity of the upper limb first, then very often we find that the shoulder or the upper limb as a whole can move with a lot less pain and a lot less need for protection. So something to think about there, respecting the interaction between the neurology and the biomechanics within a contextual environment is obviously extremely important to consider.